Language tends to move from the metaphorical to the literal rather than the
Right.
reverse.
Right.
And that's exactly what he says. He says, all words then belonging to the inner world of the mind or of the imagination and are originally poetic words. The better, however, any such word is fitted for the needs of humanity, the sooner it loses its poetic aspect by the commonness of use, ceases to be heard as a symbol, and appears only as a sign. I mean, in a way, right there, I think is you can almost say that means that the depth of our perception, whether it's of nature, of creation, of scripture, of art, of ourselves, the depth of our perception is itself kind of the symptom of our spirit. Because do you see this as a symbol or a sign?
Right. Right.
You know, and like that's I would say that's the work of faith ultimately, you know?
Right. And he likes to talk about poetic relations. And I think he has a very specific thing in mind when he uses those words. And I think he's thinking of incarnation. And that is precisely what symbol is, right? It's when you bring things together. So you give life, or you give body or substance to a concept or an idea or whatever it is, right? Mm-hmm. That's what an icon is. Mm-hmm. So for George MacDonald, poetic relations is what the incarnation is.
Here we go.
Oh,
are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry. I have to let my internet in.
Yeah, he keeps using he has that nice line at one point where he says, like the whole world is but the human being inside out.
I know, yeah.
But he also will, like you're saying, he'll call it the embodiment, he'll talk about God's embodiment and all these things, so.
Right. I'm just going to read a little bit from my notes. So this essay, it seems to me, is about the incarnational quality of creation. The intersection between creation, human language, and incarnation. Striking to me is his idea that creation is God's imagination, and it's also the origin of language. For what are the forms by means of which a man may reveal his thoughts? Are they not those of nature? But although he is created in the closest sympathy with these forms, yet even these forms are not born in his mind. What springs there is the perception that this or that form is already an expression of this or that phase of thought and of feeling. For the world around him is an outward figuration of the condition of his mind, an inexhaustible storehouse of forms whence he may choose exponents, the crystal pitchers that shall protect his thought and not need to be broken, that the light may break forth. The meanings are in those forms already, else they could be no garment of unveiling. God has made the world that it should thus serve his creature, developing in service that imagination whose necessity it meets. The man has but to light the lamp within the form. His imagination is the light, it is not the form. Straightway the shining thought makes the form visible and becomes itself visible through the form. This was one of the most amazing things out of this essay that jumped out at me.
Yeah, I've always noticed and liked how he likes to use Plato's old idea that vision works by the light going out of the eyes, and then the reflection returning to the eyes. And so but and I think MacDonald, he likes to use that. He uses it in some of the fairy tales and so on, but in this poetic connection sort of way, where it's like, it's sort of Christ saying about, nothing comes out of a person except what's already in there. Out of the storehouse of their heart comes their words.
Right.
And you could say actions. And so so there's that there, to me, feels like he's hitting on that theme. But I think the second thought that comes to mind, and I like this stuff, so I'm not trying to denigrate it, but like there's a lot now about sort of the individual psyche's unconscious or subconscious, or the id or something like that, and we can sort of discover that something's within us that we are unaware of, or only vaguely aware of, or indirectly, and sort of through this different work, whether it's through therapy or through introspection or through conversations or whatever, through prayer, you can sort of unearth or disinter aspects of yourself. But what I noticed especially about, which is true, but what I noticed especially about this passage in MacDonald is that it almost sounds to me, and I know he's prior to like psychoanalysis and all that, but it sounds to me like he's saying the same is true about what we call the external world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's that it's not just thought. That's what's so amazing to me about this. And this really does get to what you call the incarnational aspect of creation, or the incarnational character of creation. It's not just that like nature can depict a generic idea.
Yeah.
Or some sort of general connection we might make on the level of poetry or images or something. It's that somehow nature, which seems in a sense the most impersonal, generic, vague thing when I consider it as just a big whole, it somehow has within it not just thoughts or forms, but my thoughts.
Yes. Exactly.
Your thoughts, like
yeah.
the thoughts unique, what I thought were unique to me, and in a sense they are. I mean, he's playing with the whole you discover, you create, creation, discovery are sort of all one. But that to me, that's such a beautiful and interesting and rich thought. I wonder what you think about that.
Oh, I love it. So you pointed out to me once that, or I heard you saying it, I don't know if we were in conversation, but you mentioned a quote from George MacDonald: God always means what he says. We always mean more than what we say.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why, what the quote because God imparts meaning into his creation. And I think when God talks about creation, when Maximus talks about creation, when George MacDonald talks about creation, that includes us.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a separate thing from us.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's all one thing. And we act on it, and it acts on us. And so there's a conversation happening within God's creation with his creation.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's always seemed to me that it's a reciprocal relationship, right? That these things are drawing each other towards each other.
Mm-hmm.
And the God always means what he says, and we mean more than what we say, is because the meaning that God imparts to something is so fractal and multivalent that if we use, because language is derived, according to George in this essay, language derives itself from creation. We look around us, as he says in the essay, for something to use to express our inner thoughts and feelings, and we take from creation to do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
He uses the word emotion to as an example, and but within that form is an eternity of meaning.
Yes,
because God put it there. So, but God is saying exactly what he wants to say with it.
Mm-hmm.
When we use that word to express ourselves, we're using only a tiny portion of the meaning that's contained within it. And I think that this is really interesting because it's become apparent to me over the years that the most difficult thing that we have in communicating with each other is conveying our meaning. Right?
Mm-hmm.
For this reason, because the meaning is so powerful, really. Like, it's so huge that we can never really be precise enough with our words to get our meaning across. And so we say, do you know what I mean?
Right, exactly. Yes.
You know?
Yes. And we say, I like this, right? Whether it's in, they say it all the time in French, tu vois, or
yeah, you see,
or you see, right? And we tie that up, right? The kind of meaning you're talking about, the meaning that we sense, and why it is that we never quite say what we mean. It's because anytime I'm meaning anything or signifying anything, even to myself, I don't always. I'm picking up resonances that I didn't necessarily intend. So the scope of my intentionality is not sufficiently dilated in order to let in the full light of meaning, which is coming through everything.
Right.
even myself, it's coming from myself. I love that passage, which I'm sure we'll get to in a little bit, where he has this odd moment where he kind of considers the unconscious. He does say the unconscious and depicts it as like a darkness within, but then God residing in the chamber of darkness. So isn't there a more fundamental light coming through? I mean, obviously that reminds me of the end of Lilith and everything, but still, like, so there's this, I never say, I always mean more than I say, both because the material, as it were, from which I'm drawing, nature for language, is already has more meaning in it. And I myself as a person, as a meaning maker or seer or producer, I'm always invoking resonances whose chorus or harmony it far surpasses my composition.
Right. Yeah, no, totally. Yeah.
So at some point all I can say is, do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, do you see it? And I think that's the last thing I was going to say on this was like this to me is another point at which God's meaning, God's speaking creation, and God's incarnating into creation as creation are all one. Because because God is so, like, it's almost like God's intention. What Maximus at one point calls God, that he says God created the world through prudence, which is an odd thing to say. You know, it's God's intention is in a sense hyper determinate.
Yes.
It's so determinate. It's so utterly a unification of saying and meaning that the only thing adequate to its expression or communication is simply the reality itself of it, the embodying of it.
Right. You know? Right. Yeah. And I don't remember if it's in here or if it's in the other essay, but George MacDonald says, if not thought and act be one and the same thing for God.
Exactly. Right.
But we're going to take whatever meaning we're capable of. Exactly.
Right. So here's the I've always, maybe I can use this analogy from Plato's allegory of the cave, or just a comparison here.
Yeah.
Since we're doing dark and light, and one of the things I've always really admired about that that story, which everyone who's ever had I don't know if anyone ever invokes Plato in class, or if we've got like a survey or whatever, you would usually focus on just the story, and can be used in many ways. But one of the things that I think isn't always sufficiently dwelled upon is Plato says, when that person who gets loosened from the chains and is no longer simply looking at the shadows and sort of following the light up to the opening out of the cave where they're going to see the sun and all that, one thing that he says that I've always thought was such a keen insight is he says when that person first sees the light, they see darkness. And not only do they see darkness, some of that you can imagine, right? Acclimating, it's too bright or whatever. But the thing that's really impressive to me is he doesn't just say they see darkness. The seeing of the darkness, which is actually caused by the light, causes that person to doubt that they are going towards reality any longer. So this is what that has always told me. And then as I reread this, actually, it didn't really dawn on me until we just reread it. Yeah. That something that is just sheer meaninglessness, like utter absurdity, and something which is hyper meaningful, initially both appear the same. Yeah. They have the same effect, which is to kind of put me in a darkness.
Yeah, like an unknowability.
Exactly. And so this is what I always tell people, like, or my students, I always say, like, mystery, it can be said in many ways and invoked in different moments. And sometimes there is such a thing as a determinate mystery, like something that it's not just you don't know, but maybe you will. It's something that must be a mystery. Right. And that's actually very hard won. That's not just a random admission of ignorance. That's a what Niklas Paschburg would have called a learned ignorance. It's an ignorance that ought to be ignorant in order to know it. Right. It's sort of this, like, people can sort of debate the question of whether or not my meaning or my perception of meaning in nature or in poetry or literature Is this something that I just find already objectively given? Something I didn't really then therefore could create or generate or contribute to? Or is this something I wholly and completely concocted, fancy, as that initial interlocutor was worried about, was why don't we just stick with the facts rather than fancy?
Yeah.
But I love, so in a sense, this is really one of the main messages throughout the whole essay, as I take it, is that he's trying to explode the whole framework. You can't say there's only fact and fancy unless you have completely mastered the realm of both.
Yeah.
Right. And so, and the truth is, even though there's a phenomenological or an experiential truth to the idea that, sometimes when some thought comes, something like from my depths, or some phrase, or some insight, I don't always know who is the author of that.
Mm-hmm.
Whence does it come? Is it true or not? Does it have any meaning, or is it just sort of mumbo jumbo? There is an initial sort of phenomenal experiential moment of unsettlement, and I just don't know where I'm at.
Barfield is also exploring language and where language comes from, which is really what MacDonald is doing. He starts there. He starts with language to illustrate that it's from creation that we are able to communicate. Like, I love the example he uses where he's like, you can only get so far with making faces.
Right.
And then you go to panic mode. You're searching around for something to, hook onto, so you can give your friend your inner feelings, about something.
But it is also feeling which stimulates activity in the larynx and its neighboring organs. Feeling is at work here. The imagination, German Vorstellung, is merely pushed into the feelings. It is feeling which is at work. We know that the sounds of speech and of singing are activated by the larynx.
Again, I try to put this forward as a way of even interpreting scripture, but I would ultimately say the whole world, because it's all the word's body, embodiments. Is I can look at you, Sherry, and I can look at other people, and what actually happens is I see the word, the meaning of God, God's thoughts. I see something, some content, some determination, some aspect of the word that I could not find anywhere else in all of the cosmos.
Right.
And yet it's reciprocal, like you were saying, the conversation, because now after I see that in you, and of course you're an inexhaustible wellspring too, and so everyone is, so it's not like that ends, but say I learned something of Christ in you, I can now, it's not just now that helps me sort of get Christ intellectually. Now I start to see the very thing I saw in you, but that you inflected in a way that I couldn't otherwise see. Now I go back and see it in everything.
Right. Yeah. Now it's yeah. Well, out of that quote that you just read before this, the MacDonald quote, he says, yes, provided we can understand that which is the individual, the man can know and not know that it knows.
Exactly.
Can create and yet be ignorant of the virtue that has, and I'll just say, he says gone, but in light of Maximus, we can say flows out of it.
Yes.
Right. And this is, I love that. I've always loved that statement. Be ignorant of the virtue that flows out of you, right? The thing that you were just talking about, where somebody sees Christ in you and then starts to see it all over the world, like everywhere they look, kind of thing. It's what saints do.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Like, they're totally ignorant of the virtue that's flowing out of them because of their humility. So it's also because of their humility. It's so weird. Like, their humility makes them ignorant of the virtue that flows out of them, which makes them feel like the chiefest of sinners.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
This sort of sounds to me like, Matthew 25. Lord, when did we see you and feed you?
Right. Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah.
They didn't even know they were feeding Christ. Now that says something about Christ, because it says something about his kenosis. He's so self-effacing, that he's easily misrecognized all the time.
Yeah.
But also, it says something about them, like you were just saying, which I hadn't quite thought of until you just said that, which is that they also are so self-effacing. They don't even realize the virtue within them that's coming out of them.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, that's great.
I know. It's incredible. Okay.
I want to say one last thing. You've unleashed me. You kind of know the art. It's called the art of the speaker. You know how to stress certain words or to elongate certain syllables that are not by nature long,
right.
but you make them long by pronunciation.
Yeah.
So that they match, for example, and sort of create a greater harmony or resonance with other words around it, or a stanza or poetry. And so what's so interesting to me is that image is then, no, you are not divine. You're not deified by nature in the sense of like you're not just God from the very get-go. However, God makes you his own children. He makes you gods. Maximus would say by position, which to me, in other words, it's because all this comes through the word, God pronounces us in such a way that even though we're by nature mortal, right, we're not fit for being divine. His own pronunciation in and through the very sort of structures of our being, makes us what he is by nature.
Through resonance.
Exactly, through resonance, through grace, his favor pouring through all the stuff we've been talking about.
So we come into harmony.
Yeah.
With God. Oh, wow.
God means what he says, and he is what he means.
Yes. Yes.
That's the embodiment aspect, right? The incarnational aspect. Right. And so, like Maximus loves to say, if you search for the logos in all things, its own logos, its own principle, its own sort of structure of the way it is, you are simultaneously clinging to the logos.
Right.
The word. It also, I think, has this sort of amazing implication, and this is really mind-bending to me. And I know we're running up against the time here, but God